We're going to get started by showing you a video that CNBC published, I think, earlier this year, or yeah, last year, and a little bit of talk about what 5G is, and that's going to really set the stage for the discussion that we're going to have for the next few minutes. So let's get this thing started.
So I thought the video, as well as the presentations this morning from Mike as well as Ruben, touched upon a lot of the similar topics that I'm going to talk about today, but I thought it put things in perspective. And what I'm going to try to do is touch upon some of the things that, from my view, what 5G is about, some of the things that AT&T is doing, and then hopefully try to connect the dots with some of the valuation topics. Which button do I push? Forward. So when I think about 5G, I mean, it certainly is about traffic. We talked about traffic, and if you look at the chart on the left there, you know, the expected traffic, and we've seen this with 3G, 4G, now 5G, this forecast for 5G, traffic is expected to explode. For AT&T, if you go back to 2007, we've seen our traffic increase by, and I couldn't believe this number, 470,000%. So if you think about it just from an economics perspective, you know, and if you assume an average ARPU of $40, and the rates would increase relative to the number of traffic, I think you're looking at an average rate of about $18 million, which is about close to what we pay Carl per hour. So. But, you know, it's a lot more than traffic, and we talked about, you know, some of the issues and where things are headed. It's really about, when you look at it, it's also about a lot of the applications that we're looking at. We're looking at self-driving cars and virtual reality and the Internet of Things. And all these applications require not only high-capacity applications, but they also require very low latency. You can't have a self-driving car and have real low and have latency issues with it. Otherwise, it's going to crash. And so that's sort of what 5G is opening up. And you know, I'm going to ask a question. When do you think the first concept or prototype for a self-driving car came up? Does anyone have an idea? That's close, but a little bit later than that. 90s? Yeah. Well, I'm not sure this was the first one, but one of the early ideas came up in the 80s. And a friend of mine was working as an intern for a law firm in California, and they had a case come in, and this guy was suing General Motors for misrepresentation. And so as they started digging around and wanted to find out what was going on, what the case was about is he'd bought a brand new Cadillac. He was driving up I-5, and he'd been on the road for a couple hours, and he got sleepy. So he decided to put it on cruise control, climb in the back seat, and go to sleep. So now 5G won't cure the what people do, but certainly the idea, the concept of you can kind of figure it out. So this is an illustration, and this isn't too much different than what we saw this morning. So this is a roadmap of sort of what 5G is about for AT&T at this point. We had rolled out 5G last year, started to. We had, with 5G and 5G Plus, and I'll get into what those are, but with 5G, we had rolled it out into 35 markets. That's based on the lower spectrums. And then 5G Plus was rolled out into parts of 19 cities, including Dallas, Austin, and so forth. What we're expecting is that we'll have 5G nationwide by this summer for about 200 million plus coverage for the population. This is a chart that just compares 4G to 5G, and then sort of a hypothetically what 6G is about. You can see the theoretical throughputs on that and a low latency. As the video pointed out, to download a movie, when you compared it 4G to 5G to 3G, a 2-hour movie would take 26 hours, 4G, 6 minutes, and then under the theoretical throughputs that are displayed here, a 5G movie could be downloaded in 4 seconds, so considerably faster. And my son, who likes the game a lot, he would certainly like that. Part of the challenges, we're talking about 5G and some of the early developments on it. Right now, there's a very limited number of handsets. Samsung Galaxy has a handset. There's some very few other handsets that are out there. I think Apple is expected to roll out a 5G phone later this year. And as soon as handsets become more available, I think you'll start seeing more adoption of 5G, and that's consistent with how AT&T is deploying 5G this year. We saw variations of this chart earlier. From a spectrum, and spectrum really is the driver of this. If you look at the high beam millimeter wave spectrums, what you're going to see with that is you get a lot of capacity, you got a lot of speed, propagation is very, very poor. And you're just going to have a lot of equipment and very densified networks. In contrast, if you look at the 5 at the coverage low band, that's where we would deploy 5G from a coverage perspective. That's going to be your lower frequencies, 700 megahertz, 850 megahertz spectrums. You're going to get a lot of coverage, but again, the speeds are going to be low, and we're going to have to kind of figure out how to bridge those solutions together. The next slide, I think, does a better job, or at least from my perspective, of illustrating these differences. If you look at it, the dot there on the right side shows a millimeter 5G plus. That's going to be like your AT&T Stadium, or it's going to be a certain part of Dallas or Austin. Then from there, you're going to expand out to have some of your mid-band spectrum. And one of the things that Mike pointed out was the limited availability of mid-band. All the companies have some of the mid-band spectrum. It just depends on your definition. I think Ruben showed this morning you have 1.8 to 2 gigabits of spectrum out there. We have that. A lot of it's deployed right now within the 3G networks. We're scheduled to, and it's public information, we're scheduled to turn down our 3G in early 2022. So as we turn our networks down and start refarming that spectrum, then that'll become available for our 5G deployments. We talked about the densification of the networks and kind of what the deployments would be. You're going to see from an equipment perspective, you're going to have a lot of cells, a lot of antennas. These are going to be deployed on traffic poles and utility poles. We've seen some pictures this morning on that. And they're going to have to be closely connected to each other. And that's one thing with 5G compared to 4G that you're going to see is you're going to see a lot more antennas. You're going to see a lot of MIMO antennas, multiple input, multiple output antennas. And that's going to drive up the cost of the networks. And then here's an example of a 5G deployment. And what you see there is the LTE radio in conjunction with the millimeter wave radios and the antenna. And you may have, in conjunction this, you may have macro sites where you have, for the coverage piece of it, additional antennas deployed on there. And then as we transition, you'll see where 5G will be deployed in conjunction with LTE, and then you'll also see 5G deployed as standalone. And you'll see those acronyms out there, SAA and non-SA, and that's what that terminology means. Steve?
Yeah, you guys have already seen this slide. This is the one we talked about with, kind of the the uh, um, the differences in the deployment type of 5G. I think we're trying to hammer home the point here that not all 5G is created equal. With the millimeter wave, you're going to get the real capacity that's being promised, and with the low band 5G rollout, you're looking at really more of a coverage, what is pretty much going to be known as even better LTE. And really the sweet spot's going to be in the mid band. But for a lot of the assessors that are out there, they're wanting to know what you're building, what was built in just this past year. And I think, being able to communicate to them what kind of network you're building is very important for them to understand. Because think about it, if you're rolling out 5G but you're doing it on a low band, then really your infrastructure is not really changing. All you're doing is swapping out the antennas. Maybe even it's just a software update depending on what you put out there so far. So really, fundamentally the infrastructure won't change if you're doing that. Now, if you're installing a millimeter wave network in a certain jurisdiction, then yeah, you're probably talking about a whole set of infrastructure changes, and the investment that's going into those individual jurisdictions is going to vary, maybe very dramatically. Maybe you have lower pole ownership costs. Maybe you have, different type of antenna investment. Maybe you have dramatically more software just because you're dealing with a different type of network for those type of deployments. I think that's going to be very important to understand and relay to them. But we've been going through this process this past year, and I anticipate we'll be discussing this a lot more as the year goes along.
Yeah, Ruben, let me jump in here real quick on this chart. And for those that don't know me, let me give you a little bit of background. I'm a little bit of a smart ass, okay? So just let me start off by saying that. The reason I bring that up is to give you a little personal note for myself is that I'm always looking for new things. And this year, I am proud to say that I started meditating this year, right? So I'm pretty religious about meditating now. I dedicate about 15 minutes a day to meditation. And why do I make this comment and reveal this to you guys? Because in the day, 24 hours a day, there are 1,440 minutes. And I meditate 15 minutes a day. And I want you to know that I am now a loud and proud 1%er, okay? So I am rocking it, right? So just for the record. But outside of the humor side of things, if we go back through the competition in our industry, I want to give AT&T some kudos here for their confidence, right? And the reason I say that is they tried to purchase T-Mobile multiple years ago. And as part of that failed acquisition, they gave us $4 billion in cash, a couple $1 billion in spectrum, and a great roaming agreement. And ever since then, we've been off to the races, right? So we've been growing drastically over the time. And we're still the little guy, right? We're the competitive little guy. We're the scrappy guy out here. We're the guys that are willing to take the gloves off and go out and scrap. That's what we have been doing. That's what we'll continue to do. And this chart here is very symbolic of what the new T-Mobile is going to look like that Ruben has up here. You've got the magenta and you've got the yellow, right? And that yellow, that mid-band, is basically Sprint's mid-band spectrum. They have a whole bunch of spectrum in the 2.5-ish gigahertz, right, that is mid-band, about 130, 160 megahertz nationwide, right? And that is part of the foundation of what the new T-Mobile is going to look like, right, in utilizing that mid-band. So we're talking about 100 megs that we can dedicate to 5G, that will penetrate walls, that will go a lot deeper and a lot farther than, the millimeter wave technology.
Steve, I didn't even realize that until you pointed it out. This is a slide that we downloaded from the CTO, Neville Ray. I did not notice that until you pointed it out, that the yellow, and that's
Little
Sprint's
symbolic,
color.
huh? Yeah.
That is Sprint's color right there. And, you've got the low band and the millimeter wave, which are T-Mobile colors. So.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple other things I do want to share about the new T-Mobile. NewTmobile.com is the website. You want to look at all the statistics out there, right? But one of those important days about this new T-Mobile, and I'm just going to throw this date out there. The journey began April 29th, 2018, right? Last year, I sat here in this conference and I said, oh, yeah, the deal's going to close pretty soon. Well, guess what? A year later, we're hoping the deal's going to close pretty soon. And this time, I am more confident than last year because the judge has heard the case and it's closed, right? So we're expecting 30 to 45 days from now, we'll get a decision one way or the other. I'm leaning on the confidence side, but let's talk about some of the issues on the street and where that falls out at. The strike price on the deal, a couple of us were talking last night, Dave and I were chatting, that the stock price, the exchange rate, I'm just going to round it up, is about 10 to 1, okay? Sprint stock right now, trading at $5 a share. T-Mobile rounded, trading at $80 a share, right? So you can see that there's a significant discount to that 10 to 1 price. And there's arbitrage to be made should you think the deal's going to go through, right? And or if it doesn't go through, I don't know what position that puts Sprint in going forward. But yeah, there's a lot of risk around the deal. Couple other things dealing with the new T-Mobile. Let's talk about we lit up our 5G network, right? As of the end of the year, we're covering 200 million pops. That's what we put out publicly. There may be some question marks around that, but I think we're going to stand up to that 200 million covered pops as of the end of the year. And Mike made this comment earlier in the presentation today. We are the coverage winner, right? And that plays well. And why does that play well into T-Mobile's hand on this new T-Mobile, right? Because there's a couple new initiatives that we launched in late December when we announced the CEO change and some of the first initiatives under the new T-Mobile, right? One of those new initiatives is called Connecting Heroes. What does that mean? We are offering free 5G access for a 10-year commitment to all public service heroes. That's police, fire, EMS nationwide, right? So we are stepping up in a big way and saying, here, we are going to be part of every community, and we are going to offer free access to a 5G network. That's one of the major ones. The next major topic is Project 10 Million, right? And that Project 10 Million that came out as the next major initiative for the new T-Mobile is we are putting forth a $10 billion commitment. That's $10 billion commitment, right, to eradicate the homework gap, right? And what does that mean? We're offering free service to 10 million households nationwide, right, under the new T-Mobile and this new 5G footprint with these combined assets in the spectrum from Sprint and the new T-Mobile network. And David talked about this earlier also, right, that we're going into local communities, that there is a gap on broadband in rural areas, right, and that is T-Mobile's focus under the new T-Mobile. And I'll stop there and hand it back to Ruben.
Okay. Well, this might be a good time to open this up for some Q&A. I think, if there's any questions that you guys are thinking about, and just questions and concerns about how this, may impact either the compliance or the valuation or just general considerations from the future, fire away.
Any questions?
So I was going to skip my question of, are you still just a little bit of a smartass, or did the meditation change that? But that's for a later question. Yeah.
I'm working on it.
So, so from the aspect of rolling out the 5G, what does the user see from that? I see the hype of the commercials with the magenta lines flying down the street, but what does the user get from your 5G rollout?
We're working on it. Higher speeds, more reliable speeds, right, being low band. So that is the commitment today, right? As we progress into the new T-Mobile, the bigger component of that is that yellow piece with the Sprint assets, another 130 megahertz, right, of dedicating it solely to 5G. So that will be an accelerator in very short order after this deal closes.
So is your plan, is your plan for this year just to stay in the low bands, pending the deal, I guess is lack of better words?
Yeah, I should know our complete spectrum position, but I don't. I will tell you that we have millimeter spectrum as part of our Metro deal, and we've acquired some other millimeter wave over time, right? We do not have a uniform nationwide footprint in millimeter wave right now, but we are looking at that. We are looking at small cells also, right, in the 5G. But we talked about it earlier, and the first 5G phones out there, Galaxy is one of them, right? You can get the Galaxy Note 10 5G version, and ours is a low band. It is a 600 megahertz, right? So you're going to see good, reliable coverage at very decent speeds, right, compared to the LTE network today.
I want to follow that up. Looking at the lessons starting from Larry's presentation this morning, that we can learn a lot from analogy. When 2G and 3G came along, we had this name PCS, and there was the projection that we were going to move from large cells to very small cells, the pico cells, if you were. Cell size definitely shrank, but not to that extent. Is it possible that what we'll be left with is, on a practical matter, because of the cost of utilizing the millimeter for regular communication, that virtually all telephony will be kept in the low and the mid band, and that millimeter band will only be used for specific machine to machine?
I mean, I can give you my perspective on it. I think you're going to see handoffs. It's going to be so you'll have low band coverage. So if your normal data type stuff, we're going around. But for a while, I think a lot of your millimeter wave type deployments will be in the very urban, very densely populated areas. Just because one, the cost to deploy it. Two, I think it's going to take some time for. I mean, we talked about the millimeter waves, but it's going to take some time for a lot of the low band spectrum become available because it's already been deployed. Unless you buy new spectrum, there's not a lot left out there. So I think over time, that's from my perspective, that's what you're going to see. You're going to see it in stadiums. You're going to see it downtown areas, and then you'll see in conjunction with that deployments of 5G on the low band frequencies.
And Augie, if I heard you, you were talking about voice, right? That was your focal point?
Starting point, yeah.
Yeah. I don't think voice will go to the millimeter wave, right? Voice is a very, very low percentage, right, of our network data traffic today, right? I want to say over 90% of our voice traffic today is VoLTE currently, right? So we're using our mid-band and low-band spectrum today to provide that. So we are one of the more forward carriers out here and putting voice out there. So we've done that fairly efficiently, right? So I don't think we'll be actually getting into voice. At least that's my non-engineering look at it.
I think that's a pretty interesting point to make, that if you're talking about allocating functionality based off of the frequency range, we were talking about this earlier over lunch, that the idea of a connected car sounds entirely plausible given the future, but you think about the mobility of the car as it drives from one area to another. If you're in low band territory where it has great LTE type service, and then all of a sudden it's driving through an urban center which then has millimeter wave access, and then all of a sudden your capability goes through the roof. Well, I think if you're going to develop a connected car, you're going to need some kind of consistency, some type of service and capability that can operate within the lowest possible bandwidth settings. It's not going to be, you can't offer a service that's just constantly jumping around and giving you, huge amounts of throughput and then small amounts of throughput. There needs to be some consistency, at least on that front.
Let me just follow up on that too. Another topic is competition out there in the industry, right? And this is a highly competitive industry, and it's only going to get more competitive, both in the rural areas from David's perspective, right, and in the metro areas. And let me just talk about one of the charts that was discussed earlier. I think Larry put it up talking about broadband, right, and the cycle of broadband, and going from broadband started with the telcos and copper lines and how do you provide. Then it moved to cable, and cable said, hey, we got this. We can take care of it. We'll put fiber out there. We'll do a better job of it, and we'll be the leaders in broadband to the home, right? And that is transitioning again, right? That competition we talked about, fixed wireless. You're still going to have fiber, to a cell site, but from the cell site to the home, it's going to go to wireless, right? So it's this evolutionary process. And, we're the little guy out there, right? We have 86 million customers, but we're the little guy, right, compared to the giants AT&T and Verizon. And I just want to talk about some of the competition, right, at least some of the Q4 stuff. So we pre-released our Q4 numbers, right? Our net adds for Q4, right, were 1.9 million customer net adds, right? Of that, there were 1 million postpaid phone net adds. And why do I bring that to everyone's attention on the competitive front? Is because Verizon and T and Sprint are just not our competitors, right? We've got Comcast out there and Charter are also our competitors. And Comcast released this morning, right? I happen to look at a couple of the stats there, and I'll give them a quick plug. They're doing a great job, too. They had 260,000 net phone ads in Q4, right? They now have 2.1 million phone ads, right, running on their network, right, or at least subscribers from a wireless phone perspective. So they are a competitor. They're getting in the wireless business. We're getting in the broadband business. There's convergence that is going on, and this new 5G, I don't think anybody's figured it out yet on the whole Internet of Things and all the business cases that are coming along with it.
Mark?
Just quickly in terms of, we see all of the use cases that are coming out, but overall, what's the expectation for what's going to happen to gross margin or ARPU, whichever you want to speak to, as the 5G changes roll into the network? How are you going to pay for it, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
One of the things that this reminds me of is Ian Gillett's discussion that he had last year. A lot of the concepts with one of the byproducts of building a 5G network is the machine-to-machine ecosystem, and he equated that to a river of pennies. That there's a lot of little bitty dollars out there that you'd be able to leverage, but that said, that's a significant, an enormous amount of spend to develop the infrastructure to get there. I think there's a lot of dollars that are attached to the build out, but I don't even think we know where the dollars are going to be going to yet. I think they have so many problems to solve, about just how the deployment's going to take place and what portion of that is millimeter. They're doing the auctions, so clearly there's a push for the investment. But as far as the physical infrastructure and the amount of spend that's taking place, I think it's too early to tell.
But I do think that, if you look at wireless, and the history of wireless, you've seen pressure on rates, on the ARPUs consistently on that. You have to continue to make those investments in order to be cost effective and to be able to compete. If you don't make those investments, it becomes to the point where with all this data and the growth in the data and so forth, if you don't have a more efficient network, you can't afford then to provide those services. So, Ruben's right, it's going to take some time on that, but long term, you're going to have to make those investments.
Yeah, and from T-Mobile's perspective, without directly answering your question on ARPU, I will tell you that it's focused on the customer, right? And we're customer focused. And when I say that, we want to deliver a product that makes customers happy. And if customers are happy, they stay on the network, we gain economies of scale, and we add more customers, right, which basically creates more profitability. And that is our focal point. That's what we've been driven through today, and there's no stopping us anytime in the future.
I think the other thing I would add, too, and I know I was reading an article here in the last couple of weeks, and it talked about part of the danger, and I can see this in my own family, that you're getting to a point where you're kind of commoditizing the wireless products. You go and my kids have free unlimited data usage, so they can just do what they want, and then when it gets to a gigabit, they're not going to really correlate that to I've got to pay a lot more money for that, and so I think we're running a little bit of a danger too, that as we become more efficient, people start just viewing this as, well, this is just, I can just get for the same price, I can double my volume and so forth. I think we've got to be a little bit careful and conscious of that as we go down the road.
And if you're unhappy with your service, Gary, just give me a call, okay? A couple other topics that were mentioned earlier, small cells. And the only thing I'd like to further elaborate on that is this continued tension out there, right? Anytime we have to site a facility, site a cellular site, whether it's a macro site or a small cell, right, there is always going to be pushback, and I just want to reiterate that. This is an age-old issue, and just for everybody's clarification, I'll say it one more time, it's the old NIMBY effect, right? Not in my backyard. No one wants to look at it, no one wants to see it, but they all want great coverage and service. And that goes for the wireless industry, goes for the cable industry, goes for any other major utility. No one wants the coal plant or the fired facility, the gas generation facility in their backyard, but they want to make sure they got the lights are on and they're running, right? So it's not a new phenomena. It's just getting more attention, right, as we're putting it on every other street light from a small cell perspective. Other comments or questions?
Now, is that the view of the Justice Department?
Excuse me? How do I view the Justice
No.
Department?
You have your view of who your competitors are. Is that how the Justice Department viewed that?
I do believe they do. And I don't want to step out of turn on this because this has been an ongoing new T-Mobile litigation, right? But the Justice Department approved the acquisition of Sprint, right, from a 4-to-3 carrier model. And part of that issue was some of the concessions that we had looked at, right? And one of the concessions we made last summer, if all aren't knowing of that, is that Sprint agreed to sell its Boost brand and all the customers, right, to Dish, right? And Dish has been around for a while, and that's probably a side comment. Charlie Ergen is a gambler, and these are not T-Mobile's comments. These are my own personal comments, so please don't associate these with T-Mobile. But he's a gambler, right? He went and stockpiled a whole bunch of spectrum, and he was gambling on trying to figure out an exit strategy. And T-Mobile came along and decided to make an acquisition of Sprint, and I think that put him in a bind, right? His options are he was forced to build a network, right? He could probably sell to Verizon, right? I don't think AT&T has the appetite for more, but maybe AT&T is another option. But right now, he is the fourth major carrier, right? And basically the Justice Department and the FCC told him to, in my own personal words, told him to shut up, right? Put up or shut up. And basically that's what they did to him because he was sitting on $20-30 billion worth of spectrum that he didn't deploy yet. And they said, we've sold this to you. You have some time commitments. This is the fastest, most efficient way for you to build that network, right? So along with that, Dish has a 7-year roaming agreement. I believe it's a 7-year, don't quote me, 5 or 7-year roaming agreement that tapers off over time. It has back office support from T-Mobile. So they are going to have the ability to quickly establish a nationwide network, create retail, run it, build it up, right, and be another competitor out there along with Comcast and Charter, right, and more to come. So we do think it's a very active and competitive market, and that's a position that we've taken.
This may be a question actually for the audience, maybe that part of the audience right there at the second table back. Yeah, for Mark over there. No, cable is a competitor, as you said. What is the cable company's reaction to 5G? Has that changed the business model of what you're looking at? Because you're using part of your Wi-Fi network, and then you roam over to another carrier. But as 5G speeds deploy, will that Wi-Fi network still support that, or do you have to look at some other options, or do you know?
Support just the mobile service?
Yeah, well, just the speeds that people will come to expect. Will that Wi-Fi network that you have, will it provide the speed capability that the 5G network that Steve has be available on your Wi-Fi network, or are you going to have to augment your Wi-Fi network in your footprint to help on the speed side? You know?
Sure. Yeah, I think it will be able to keep up eventually. It will probably require new Wi-Fi 6 Wi-Fi hotspots in the future, particularly to manage a larger number of devices. Wi-Fi 6 is much more capable in that regard, offering higher speeds and multiple device management, but I think it will be able to keep up along with the other additional investments in the cable network.
And are you also looking at small cell deployment, or are you still going to rely on kind of the Verizon agreement for that?
I'm sure everything is being looked at. As of now, there has been no plans announced for any small cell 5G deployment from Comcast.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if there's a quiet period with one of the auctions going on right now either. I should have looked at that before I got up here, right? But I think there are multiple participants in some of the auctions. One other comment from my perspective, talking about bringing it back to valuation and looking at balance sheets of corporations is lease accounting. And I just want to give a quick 30-second plug on lease accounting. Lease accounting standards changed for a lot of us this last year, right? And so I'm just going to give you some round T-Mobile numbers, right, just to put it in perspective. So our PP&E, right, our net PP&E on our balance sheet as of 12/31 last year was $23.5 billion, okay? As of 9/30, you look at our Q3 numbers that were released, our PP&E, right, was $22.1 billion, okay? And we're saying, why did it go down? Well, because it gets into the ROU assets, right, or the right of use assets. So we had to take our capital leases on our book and put them in a new section, okay? So we had to specifically call out our capital leases and call it right of use, and there was $2.9 billion, okay? I add those two together, and that's an apples to apples comparison, and as of 9/30, right, there was $25 billion in PP&E. So we have been growing, expanding our network, building out in rural areas, right, trying to make sure we get that national coverage. So we went from $23.5 billion to $25 billion, $1.5 billion. That's the one component of it, right, the right of use asset. The other one that I want to bring to everybody's attention is the operating lease side of it, right? On the operating lease side of the right of use asset, which were non-capitalized in the past, right, and we have to demonstrate it on our books and records now, that number as of 11/30 is $11 billion, right? So if someone looks at our balance sheet incorrectly, they're going to go, oh, I got $25 billion plus another $11 billion, and I got $36 billion for the PP&E. And that is a misrepresentation, right? Those operating leases are a right of use asset, and it's a lease commitment, right? The easiest way to explain that is to think of a retail location. You've seen a T-Mobile in a strip mall. You've seen them in the malls, right? We lease those spaces, right? We're not the owner of that. We lease it. We put up the T-Mobile sign. We make a magenta. And effectively, under the new accounting standards, you have to look at the most probable term, right? And this is where I'm going to get off on grounds, but it's basically, what is your remaining lease commitment on your current term, right? So they're looking at that, and they're discounting that to present value, and they're putting all of that on the books, right? So if you go after that, you're effectively double taxing, because we're just a tenant in the building, right? And if you go after that value on our assessment and you valued it, and the local assessor also valued the mall or the strip mall, the real estate, it would be a double taxation issue. So I just wanted to bring that up for clarification.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The more information, I would say, as the taxpayer that that it can provide to the assessor, I think it makes sense. If you're talking about something where you're deploying a network similar to what you have in years past, then at the very least you can say, look, we added 512 poles or 512 towers this year in this particular state, and last year we added 432. So not that dramatically different. If the story is much different, that if you're saying we added X amount of utility poles that is way out of whack, then at least you have some explanation. As far as the lease accounting is concerned, you might be looking at metrics and then trying to extrapolate and coming up with numbers that just don't make any sense. That your typical pole cost or typical utility cost, maybe you're extrapolating a number that says that it's $500,000 per utility pole. Well, that's not realistic. Clearly you have to find a way to suss out those numbers to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples. And really separating the lease accounting stuff from what's traditionally been there in the past. No other questions? Okay, well, I think we've hit the 3:45 mark.